Hello and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope you enjoy today's session. It's in the lease, key items to review with refugee renters. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions like this one, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so please go ahead and enter your questions in throughout. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box and we will assist you. Additionally, a recording will be sent to everyone of today's webinar. This brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter for today is Lynette Pearl. Lynette is the Senior Associate of Housing at Refugee Housing Solutions. Lynette, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So we're going to go ahead and get into this presentation today. So for a newcomer to be a successful renter, they must understand that it is a binding legal contract. And there are some vital things to review and understand in a lease for them to be successful to have a successful rental tenure. So with this Lunch and Learn, I'm going to highlight the most critical items to review and understand during the rental process, and you can go over that with your newcomer when they're trying to lease up. Next slide. So what is a lease? So what is a rental lease? A rental lease, it is a contract between a landlord and a tenant or tenants that allows the tenant to lease or rent the landlord's property for a specific amount of time and under certain conditions. So now that you know the basic definition of a rental lease, it's imperative to know the key things to review and understand before signing. Next slide. So we're going to talk about terms. So lease terms, they do vary from state to state, but the most common lease term is a year, with short-term leases being 3 to 6 months. Depending on the duration, you can determine if it is a rental lease or rental agreement. Rental agreement terms are usually 30 to 90 days, with the lease being 6 to 18 months. So the length of time will help you determine if it's a rental agreement or a lease. So based on this snapshot, because I am an example type of person, as you can see, this is an actual lease I took. This is based on the terms, this will be considered a year lease. So it's a term. Look at the terms. So landlord or housing provider contact information, that's another thing you need to look at in a lease. A point of contact should be listed in the rental lease. And it should also outline who is the contact, if applicable, if there is a property management or third-party entity. So some of these landlords, especially the larger property apartment complexes, they do have a third party that does manage their actual property. So in that lease, it should tell you who the property management contact person is, and also if there's an emergency, who to contact during an emergency. So that should be part of your lease. Another thing you need to look at is the start and end date. That's very important because the start date of a lease is when it is legally binding. So a lease typically starts on the first of the month. However, it's not uncommon for a lease to start mid-month, such as on the 15th. So again, we're going to look at this snapshot. So based on this snapshot, this lease legally starts December 1st, 2022, and it ends 11:59 p.m. on November 30th and 2023. So that's very important because we're going to look at these dates because these dates are key to understanding other parts of a lease. Next slide. So many times a rental lease date ends on the date stated, but not always. Some rental leases automatically renewed. unless written in the lease. So that's very important that you know what renewals are in that lease. So most rental leases require a renewal notification from 30 to 60 days before the end date. So at that time, landlords should be either mailing, emailing, or hand delivering a lease that states the renewal status in the process. So it's also important to review the lease terms during the renewal process. This is very important because the landlord or housing provider will use that renewal process as opportunity to change the terms and conditions of the lease. So when you're going through a renewal, that's an opportunity. If the landlord wants to increase the rent, they can increase the rents or change the conditions. So again, we're going to look at the snapshot. So with this snapshot, it shows that the lease does not automatically renew. So that's very key and that's very important. So what does that mean? So this requires that the tenant give the landlord 60 days written notification before the lease and the date or the intent to move out date. So we're going to go back to the snapshot again. And as you can see, it's highlighted and it says this lease contract is not automatically renewed. So if the tenant wants to move out of the premises before the expiration date of the lease of the contract, based on this lease, it must give at least 60 days written notice of the intent to move out as required. So this is very important. We'll talk about that later. Reason why these dates and the time periods are very important in the lease. So the next slide. As you can see, this is an actual renewal, how to do a lease renewal. As I stated earlier, landlords are required to send this out if they're going to renew the lease. And this is just an example of what a renewal letter will look like. Again, it varies from landlord to landlord. So this is just an example because I'm an example type of person. So this is just, you can review this to see what an actual lease, a renewal lease letter looks like. Next slide, please. So we covered what you should know about renewals, but what about non-renewals? This is very important as well. So FYI, a landlord is not required to extend a renewal nor give a reason. However, the refusal cannot be due to discriminatory reasons or out of retaliation. So what is discrimination in housing? That means when a landlord or a housing provider treats an applicant or a tenant differently from other applicants or tenants in a way that's protected by the Fair Housing Act. Retaliation in housing is when the landlord or housing provider does not renew a lease because the tenant asserted their rights during the rental tenure. So below are examples of how a tenant can assert their rights during a lease. For example, if you have a refugee or newcomer who is asking for repairs to the unit, and the landlord is kind of it, and after the end of their lease, they decide not to renew it, that could be a sort of retaliation. Or if they're participating in a tenant group to express to make sure their rights are being honored, and again, at the end of the lease, they notice they're not getting a renewal, that is a sign of retaliation by the landlord housing provider. Or if you have a newcomer or a refugee who is leasing and they do file a complaint against the landlord or the property management company, and towards the end of the lease, they do not get a renewal, that could be another example of them retaliating against them. So again, renewals are not automatic. However, if a landlord is not renewing a lease due to the fact it might be retaliation, then that tenant has a cause to file a complaint against that landlord and housing provider. Next slide. So even if a tenant does not want to renew their lease, they must still provide proper notice to vacate. So this is very important too before moving out. By knowing a landlord's notice to vacate and renewal policies, a tenant can provide proper notice while preventing financial fees. So also, if a proper notice to vacate notification is not given, a landlord can require the lease to be extended. So that's very important. When you review the lease, you need to know their policy when it comes to notice to vacate. So again, let's review the snapshot to determine when the notice to vacate needs to be submitted to the landlord. So based on this contract, this actual snapshot, the notice to vacate needs to be submitted no later than 10/1/23. And the reason why is because based on this lease, the lease requires the tenant give the landlord 60-day notice before the lease ends date. So based on the lease end date is 11/30/23. So I'm going to use me as an example. I am the tenant and I decide I'm not going to renew my lease. So based on this date, I would have to give them notice on 10/1/23 in order to be in compliance with the 60-day notice to vacate. So we're going to go for an example again. So for example, we're going to talk about I Miss Need a Home. So Miss I Need a Home, she wants to move out before the 11/30/23 end date because that's the end date of her actual lease. So she wants to terminate her lease early. So based on that, she will be required to give the landlord 60-day notice, and she'll be required to pay an early termination subletting fee. So the one thing is, if you're terminating your lease early, you can be prone to a termination fee. And we'll talk about that later in the presentation. So based on this, Miss I Need a Home, if she's going to leave, she would move out May 1st. With that date, she would need to submit a notice to vacate on March 2nd. So there, in order for her to be in compliance, she would have to give that 60-day notice, and that would be March 2nd, 2023, because her goal is to move out on May 1st. So for her to be in compliance with the 60-day notice, she would have to give that notice March 2nd, 2023. So one thing you can, with the notice to vacates, again, it varies from landlord to landlord. Some landlords, they do have a formal notice you have to use to do the notice to vacate, and they require you to submit it in a certain way. So again, before you sign that lease, you need to know, okay, is there a formal notice that you guys use if I don't want to renew my lease and I want to do a notice to vacate? So make sure you know that if there's an actual documentation that you actually have to use to do the notice to vacate. Next slide. Now, some landlords, especially if you're dealing with smaller landlords, mom and pop landlords, or private landlords, they don't have an official notice to vacate letter. So here is an example of if you have a newcomer or refugee who wants to do a notice to vacate, this is just a sample of how you would do a notice to vacate. So of course you would put it in writing when you're going to vacate, make sure it's in that time period, and you do the schedule. I recommend always do a scheduled move out. Because again, you can dispute any type of damage. They cannot charge you for basic wear and tear. Take pictures. So when you do your notice to vacate, make sure you also schedule your move out time as well. Next slide. So another key thing to review in the lease is the rent amount and the late charges. That's very important. The rent amount and the due date should be reviewed before signing a lease. With market rate properties, because it's called market rate, it constantly changes. So if you have a newcomer or refugee who is about to lease up at a market rate, make sure it's that same rate that was quoted to them during the process. Because again, market rates do change. That's why they call them market rates. So before signing the lease, make sure you verify it's an affordable and that's that rate that was quoted. Now, with income base, make sure it's only 30% of that person's income. So again, with market rate, it changes. Make sure it's the rate that you guys agreed to before signing the lease. And if it's an income base, make sure it's not more than 30% of their income. So you want to make sure you check the rent amount. With income-based properties, that's 30%. We talked about that. So it's also imperative to check the due date because it will determine when a late charge will be imposed and a financial penalty. So no late fee can be collected unless it is in the lease or the addendum. So that's very important that you check when the rent is due and what is the late fee. So with the Late Fee Fairness Amendment Act, a landlord can only charge up to 5% of the rent as a late fee. So if a tenant receives a rental subsidy, it's a little bit different from market rate. The late fee must be calculated based on the tenant's portion of the rent. So the late fee is slightly different when it's project-based or it's income-based. Another thing to check is the method of payment. The payment method should be outlined in the lease. I know with larger property management companies, they usually require you to do the payment online or in a portal. It requires the tenant to have an e-commerce method of payment, such as a debit card or the net banking card. Now, if you have a newcomer or refugee who is not familiar or not IT savvy and making a payment online, you can make arrangements under reasonable accommodation with that property manager and landlord for other payment arrangements, just in case they don't have access or they don't know how to do a payment on a portal. And some property management companies are willing to work with you for other methods of payment, but make sure you get that in writing, that they're willing to take another form of payment. Now, with the security deposit, again, security deposits have some legal limitations on the amount a landlord can collect. And the limitations, they do vary from state to state, but the common practice is 1 month's rent, with some landlords charging an additional amount due to an applicant's credit or rental history. So can we go to the security deposit by state link, please? So you can get an overview how they different from state by state.
Just 1 second as I'm pulling up.
But take your time.
Could I actually ask you a question, Lynette?
Yes, ma'am.
You had mentioned method of payment, and you said like alternative method of payment. What would be an example of alternative methods of payment?
A money order, a cashier's check, those will be alternative methods of payment, especially if you have a newcomer refugee who does not have a banking system already set up.
A checking account, yeah.
And as you can see, can you scroll down a little bit, Grace? I can't see it, but hopefully everybody else can.
I can see it. I can see it. Sorry.
I can't see it. Maybe I pull this up. So let's use Alabama as an example. So as you can see, the 1 month's rent, except for a pet deposit, and we'll talk about pet deposits later. So you can use this as a resource for your state to see what are the requirements for a deposit. I also recommend, if you're not sure, contact, if you have an attorney with your agency, to make sure that you run that by your attorney before you start advocating. You want to make sure that everything's in line with your state. That's the one thing about leases. There's a slight difference state by state requirements. So this is just a resource you can use if you want to see what your state requirements is when it comes to security deposits. Okay. So we're going to talk about pet deposits, even though we talked about security deposits, and this is very important. So if you have a newcomer or a refugee and they do have a pet, with the Fair Housing Act, FYI, it's unlawful for landlord to charge an additional rent or pet deposit for service and assistant animals. So they have, if it's a service or assistant animal, they cannot charge a pet deposit. However, if the animal damages the unit, the landlord may keep some of the original security deposit, but they cannot request additional pet deposit if it is a service animal. A lot of people do not know that, and that's under the Fair Housing Act. So we're going to talk about the return of the deposit. Again, that varies from state to state and what frame. So the rental lease, it should outline when the landlord can return the deposit if a deposit, this basic wear and tear, because not everybody gives a deposit, but if you are, if the newcomer or newcomer has a deposit coming to them, it should be outlined how long that landlord should give that deposit back. And can you go to that? So again, this is just a tool to use to see what are the requirements for your state to get a deposit back. And I shouldn't put it out there, but as you notice, certain states are more tenant friendly and then landlord friendly. If you just go over this material, you can kind of figure out which states are more tenant friendly and which ones are more landlord friendly. And usually it happens to be more states in the Midwest that are more heavily landlord friendly. And the southern states as well, depending on the state. So we're going to talk about utilities that's included. This is very important because that'll affect your budget or the newcomer's budget. So sometimes utilities are covered in the monthly rent, but they are not often. So for example, water, trash removal are sometimes covered, but other services are not. So the rental lease will outline what utilities the tenant and the landlord will cover. So before a newcomer signs a lease, because again, you want to make sure the rent is affordable, you need to see what utilities they're actually responsible for and take that into consideration in their budget. Because sometimes you can look at the rent and say, oh my God, I can afford it. But then once you go in to sign a lease, you see, oh, I'm responsible for this, 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 and this. And when you do an estimation, the rent is not affordable with utilities included. Now, you do have some leases that utilities are included, and if that's the case, it should be stated in the lease. Next slide. So occupants is something you need to review in the lease. This is part of the lease that will list who can occupy the units and the occupancy requirements for the unit. So this is important. Violating this part of the rental lease with unauthorized occupants can jeopardize one's lease and could be grounds for eviction. So if there's unauthorized occupants and your landlord or property manager see that, that is grounds for eviction, just FYI. So it's very important that you review that. Appliances included. The lease will list what appliances are included in a unit or of a house. So most rentals come with white good appliances, and white good appliances are considered such as a refrigerator, stove, dishwasher, and microwave. So whatever the landlord provides, they're responsible for the repair and the maintenance. Now, if the tenant provides the appliances, then they are responsible for the repair and the maintenance. So that's very important when you look at your lease to see what that landlord is going to be responsible for what repairs. So I do know sometimes people will rent houses and have no appliances in it, and the landlord require you to bring your own appliances. If that's the case, that means that you're responsible for the repairs of the appliances. Early termination fees, as stated earlier in this webinar, leases may include an early termination clause. This clause is in place to protect the landlord in case the tenant breaks the lease. So that's very important that you explain to the newcomer that a lease is a binding contract. And if they do not fulfill that contract and break that lease, there is a termination fee. So it outlines the circumstances for when the lease can be broken, and it includes specific fees that may be required. So early termination fees, there are 1 to 2 months of rent. However, some landlords and housing providers will allow you to negotiate the early termination fees. There are certain conditions when a lease can be terminated without financial consequences. So a lease can be terminated if the tenant is an active member of the military and received a change of station or notice, or they are a victim of domestic violence, or the rental unit is safe and uninhabitable or violates health codes or safety codes. So those are grounds to terminate a lease without financial consequences. So we're going to go a little bit in some of each category. So the victim of domestic violence, so if a tenant or a co-tenant or a household member is a victim of domestic violence, harassment, sexual assault, or stalking, the tenant or the co-tenant can terminate the lease by giving written notice of termination to the landlord. Usually, landlord will request a copy of the police report and or an order of protection as sufficient documentation under those grounds. Now, if the rental unit is unsafe or inhabitable or violates health codes, under common law, every lease comes with an implied warranty of habitability. So that means the unit must meet minimum living standards based on the housing code and local laws. So if you have a newcomer that wants to break the lease due to it being uninhabitable, for a legal claim, they should research health safety codes and the landlord-tenant laws in that state in order to break the lease. Notice of entry is, again, this varies from state to state. Not each state require it. I'm going to pick on myself. I am in the state of Missouri. There's no notice of entry in the state of Missouri, unfortunately. But there are some states that uphold this, and this should be in the lease. So what a notice of entry is a formal letter a landlord has to give the tenant of the rental property to inform the tenant of the landlord's intent to enter residency on a given date or on a specific time. So with that being said, if you're living in a state that has a notice of entry, before a landlord or housing provider can enter your unit or house, they have to give you written notice. However, if there's an emergency, they do not have to give written notice. So again, you would have to check your state laws to see what your state laws when it comes to notice of entry, but it should be in the lease as well. Sometimes I've seen leases where the notice of entry is kind of ridiculous. is kind of unreasonable. So make sure you do check that if your state does honor the notice of entry. The next slide, please. Subletting. This clarifies under what conditions the tenant can sublet their unit in the process. So a sublet agreement, it is a rental contract between the original tenant and a subtenant. Now, this document is typically used when the original tenant cannot complete the terms of their lease, and subletting can be an option for when an individual needs to terminate the lease early. Again, this should be in the lease if your landlord or property manager will allow you to sublease if you cannot fulfill your lease contract. Unit modifications, part of this lease explains the process and the parameters of unit modifications. Modifications should not be made to a unit without the written approval of a landlord. Now, there's something different with unit modifications and reasonable accommodations. So if you have a newcomer that has a disability and needs a reasonable accommodation, the landlord and housing provider has to make the changes to the unit if it's a reasonable accommodation. So an example, if you have a newcomer that needs bars in the bathroom to get out of the tub, that's considered a reasonable accommodation. So they would have to make those modifications without any cost to the tenant. Before a person lease up, if you know that you have a newcomer with a disability and there are some reasonable accommodations they need, this is a time to request those reasonable accommodations before they move into the unit. For example, if they need a parking space closer to a unit, or they need a unit on a lower floor. Or, for example, if the handles need to be adjusted to make them easier to turn doorknobs in the unit, that would be considered a reasonable accommodation. They would have to make a unit modification with no cost to the tenant. So just FYI, so that's slightly different. Review all the addendums, lease addendums. They are separate documents that landlords add to an original lease. So landlords use them to provide additional information that the original lease does not cover. So with a lease addendum, it is a legal binding document both landlord and tenant must sign. With an addendum, it cannot be used to add the lease without the tenant's knowledge. So this is very important. So if the landlord wants to add an addendum, they can do that, but they have to have the tenant sign off on it, and the tenant have to acknowledge the difference of what is added in that addendum. So that's very important. So that's what addendums are. One example of an addendum would be, I know when I used to lease, would be for lead base. That I would have to sign off the addendum depending how old the building was to acknowledge I saw the addendum. There was an inspection for lead. So that's just an example of what an addendum is. The visitor policy is also something they need to review. It's common for landlords to limit overnight guests. This is how a lot of people get evicted because they don't know the visitor policy. So it's common for landlords to limit overnight guests, such as allowing guests for no more than 10 days in a 6-month period. So you need to review that. So if you have a long-term family member and it violates your lease, you can be evicted. So you need to know what their visitor policy, and if they have to be there longer, make sure you notify your landlord as soon as possible if they have to extend their visit. So you don't want to get a lease violation because of the visitor, you violate the visitor policy. Smoking policy is also important too. If the property has a clear no smoking policy in the lease and there is a violation, the landlord has every legal right to issue a lease violation, which can lead up to possible eviction. So you need to know what their smoking policy is. Now we're going to talk about the pet policy. Again, if pets are allowed, there will be a policy with the requirements of the type of pets allowed and with the dogs and the breeds and the weight restrictions. However, if the pet, again, if you need a reasonable accommodation because it's an emotional pet, then it doesn't make a difference what the pet policy is. They have to do the accommodation if it's an emotional pet. So these are things that you need to review in a lease. Next slide. So if you have any additional questions or you need to contact me on any different information or an ETA, you can contact me at lpearl@cwsglobal.org. I know this is short and sweet, so I get to the point, but I want to open up for any type of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lynette. And we're now going to begin answering any questions that you've submitted today during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit any questions in the attendee control panel on the upper right of your screen. Let me see. So Lynette, a few questions we have for you.
Okay.
Let me see. What could happen? You mentioned giving notice to vacate like 60 days ahead. So what could happen if someone didn't give notice to vacate 60 days ahead?
So I use that example because, again, notice to vacate, it varies from state to state. Sometimes it can only be 30 days. So that's why it's so important that you read your lease to see what their notice to vacate is. Time period could be either 30 or 60 days. By chance, I live in Missouri, so our notice to vacate time period is 60 days, but it might be 30 days in a different state. As I stated earlier, in your lease, if you do not give that appropriate time based on the lease, you can get an early termination fee, and that early termination fee will be outlined in the lease. Usually, common practice is 2 months rent. So that will be what the consequence is if you don't give the proper notice to vacate. Some landlords, again, it's outlined in the lease, they will extend your lease or make you financially responsible towards the end of the lease until you give that proper notice to vacate. Again, it varies from state to state.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, right? Family that you're volunteering or welcoming is thinking about moving, to go be with their family in Texas. And so, 30 days beforehand or like a few weeks before the end of their lease date, they go to their leasing office and say, hey, we're going to move to Texas. And their lease is ending in 2 weeks, right? So basically you're saying, if their notice to vacate was like a month or even 2 months, the apartment community might say, nope, sorry, you didn't give your intent to vacate on time. You need to either lease up for another year or pay X thousands of dollars in order to get
No,
out of your
because they're
lease.
towards the end of the lease. You said they're 2 weeks towards the end of their lease. They would have to. They can charge them additional 30 days because that 30-day period would be that notice to vacate time period if that's what's in the lease.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen people which, again, that's why it's so important you tell them this is a legal binding contract. They will lease up, say, for example, January, and they want to vacate the next month. Depending what's in that lease, that landlord or property manager has every right to demand the remainder of that 11 months of that lease or negotiate the termination fees. So there are termination fees. That's why
Yeah.
you have
And
to
I
be
think,
very,
yeah.
and if you know it's going to be a short-term situation, that's why you should determine, do I sign a rental agreement or a lease? Because rental agreements are more short-term, leases are long-term. That's why I want to differentiate the two, because if you know that you need something that's going to be a short-term, then you need to go into a rental agreement, not a lease.
Yeah. Let me see. Another question, is rent always due on the first of the month?
Again, that depends on the lease. Some rent are due on the 1st, some due on the 5th. So that's why you have to look at your lease to see when it's due and also when the late fee kicks in. Now, I forgot to add this. I'm glad you, the person asked that question. So if you have a newcomer that is receiving public assistance, and say if rent is due on the 1st, but they don't get their public assistance subsidy check until the 5th, they have every right to ask for a reasonable accommodation for them to get an extension to pay their rent without a late fee.
Okay, thank you.
Or if a person is getting Social Security, and their Social Security comes at a certain time, and the rent is, say, for the 1st, but they don't get their Social Security check to the 6th, they can request a reasonable accommodation without a late fee to pay their rent later when they get their check, if they're receiving some type of public subsidy or Social Security.
Let's see, another question. Do you have any tips on sharing this information with refugees or newcomers with limited language proficiency?
Well, currently we're working on trainings and getting them translated. We already have a tenant toolkit that is completed with this type of information, but we are trying to make sure that we're going to translate it. So hopefully by next year in January, we would have that tenant toolkit up on our website. We do have our landlord toolkit, and shout out to Grace. She's been working on that. So we will have that out next year for the tenants.
Great. I'm also going to put in the chat here two resources. We've done Lunch and Learns before on the Tarjimli app, which is a free way to provide on-demand interpretation through a volunteer service. And so that might be of interest to some of the people watching. If you wanted to sit down and have an interpreter, you could go back and watch that Lunch and Learn or go to the website and learn more about that app. I also wanted to mention that the Cultural Orientation Resource Exchange Core has a Settle In app and website that provides very basic housing information in, I believe it's 12 languages. It doesn't go as in detail for the lease, but if you are looking for like a housing overview, if the person that you're welcoming is interested in, housing and asking questions, that's kind of a helpful way to provide an overview. And then I think kind of getting out then that person's individual lease, right? And looking at their actual lease might be helpful. And I don't know, Lynette, I could even imagine someone kind of getting out, a highlighter or a marker or something and highlighting like the lease start date and end date on the lease. Maybe make a copy for them so you're just not messing up somebody's lease document.
And also,
yeah.
Also, because it is considered a reasonable accommodation in the Fair Housing Act, if a person needs interpretation services, the property manager and landlord are required to provide that because, again, this is a contract they're entering. You want to make sure that they understand what they're signing. So I've noticed larger property management companies, they do have resources, so tap into their resources for interpretation services. I do recommend if it's a trusted family member or a trusted friend, they can bring them along during the leasing process to help explain. I would not recommend anybody under the age of 18 because, again, it is a contract. I've seen people when I was a property manager, try to lease up and have someone under 18 to try to interpret, and I would not proceed. I said, let me go ahead and get you some services to make sure you understand what you're signing because, again, this is a legal binding contract. And we are encouraging landlords to make their process more refugee and newcomer friendly to make sure that they do have that standby service for interpretation.
Yes, and actually you mentioned the, have like a trusted friend or neighbor. And I think that's a question too. A lot of these things are gonna happen in the future, right? A year from now, maybe 2 years from now, right? If they stay in the apartment for 2 years. And so I think that that's something that a volunteer or sponsor could think about too, is that knowing that you might be sponsoring for 3 months or 6 months, that, and we were talking about like, oh, marking things on the lease, you could also have, folks mark on their calendar these different dates, whether they use an electronic calendar or maybe you even bring them in a wall calendar. And that could be the plan of like, oh, this is around when your lease renewal date is, you're gonna need to ask like a friend or neighbor maybe to come into the office, with you. So mentioning those friends or neighbors, I think is key.
And a lot of, like I said, the renewal process, a lot of the paperwork, the landlord and property manager are required to give those notifications to the tenants.
Yeah, and is it usually via email or via paper or?
Well, that's the reason why before you lease up, you need to know their preferred method of communication. I do know some landlords, they do it by email, they do it by hand. And when you're leasing up, that's why you need to make it noted in your account. This is my preferred method of communication. A lot of them ask you, what's your preferred method? Me, when I used to rent, was texting. I know that's weird, but that was more convenient for me. So, but they would also send me an email. And then of course, if it's an official document, they would have to present that to me. But again, preferred method of communication. I recommend if there's a language barrier to get it in writing. So just in case there's a misunderstanding, if they have it in writing, they can take it to someone who can do the interpretation for them and hold that landlord and housing provider accountable because now it's in writing.
Yeah, and you never know when there's going to be like staff changes or, something like that. I have a question actually from a landlord, but I think it would apply to a landlord or a newcomer or a volunteer sponsor. But and I'm going to try to summarize this. But the
Okay.
landlord was giving an example, right, of like, for example, in the property that he was renting to a refugee newcomer, the heating system was forced air and so needed a specific way to clean the vents or what have you. And it didn't happen. Long story short, he was saying that the newcomers didn't keep the vents clean. And it was, somewhat of like a cultural misunderstanding, right? That they just weren't used to cleaning these vents in this way. So he said that he or she said that this is a specific example, but the general question is, who would be responsible for expenses like this, for issues that arise because of different cultural knowledge?
Well, before I answer that, that's why it's important that you hold orientation, because if you don't know, you just don't know. And we do have a training on how landlords and property managers can hold orientations so they can explain certain housekeeping to newcomers and refugees. Based on that, if they don't know, I don't know how to answer that, because if you don't know, you just don't know. And that would not be a basic wear and tear. So I think when meeting the newcomer halfway with that particular expense, but I wouldn't know how to answer that, to be honest with you, because it's hard to hold someone accountable. Well, it depends on if they don't know. Again, this is their new rental. This rental process is totally different for them. And because I do know landlords and housing providers want to protect their assets, I would provide, those orientations so they would know how to take care of their units properly. So you won't have issues like that. So I don't know if I answered that properly for the landlord or housing provider.
Yeah, and I think it's always great when landlords provide a very thorough, orientation to any tenant, because sometimes you have people, young renters or others that have never
Yes.
owned their own washer and dryer or have never had this type of heating system. And so I think it's important for anyone. And then also, for the landlord to provide that orientation, and also for volunteers and sponsors can say, like, hey, is there anything around your home that's different from, from other homes you've lived in that you want some explanation
And I've
for?
had
So I
some
feel like,
landlords,
yeah.
in order to protect their asset, which they can put it again in the lease, is they do, quarterly inspections. I mean, that's just good, just making sure you maintain the asset. And that's how you can detect when things are going on with a unit when you do those quarterly inspections. And also, when you're getting maintenance requests, it's very important that when they're leasing up, you explain how to do a maintenance request, when a maintenance request is required, and when maintenance staff will arrive in order to take care of that, because it's a partnership. The landlord wants to protect their asset, and you want to make sure that they have a nice, clean, sanitary unit. So they have to explain that during, the lease up, that we're going to be required you to do certain things to maintain the asset, but this is our part too as a landlord, that we will fix these things in timely manner when you notify us that, because that's too important. They need to know when they have to notify the landlord when there's an issue with the units.
Yeah. Let's see. I have another question, and maybe I
Okay.
can answer it. I'll
No,
try, and
go
then
ahead.
yeah, let's see.
We can tag
But it's
team this, okay?
right. It's a question about some of the terms of the lease, right? What if it seems like the family or newcomer isn't going along with those terms? Like you had mentioned, like the visitor. What happens if they have a friend or family member that's seemingly always in the apartment? Right. What could you do? I guess my first thought is that you can be of a big help in one way. That's might be why you'd have this conversation initially, by just explaining the terms and the consequences, right? Just so that the family can make an informed decision, like, oh, it says in your lease that if someone is staying, I think the example you gave of like more than 10 days in a month or something like that, that you could be fined. And you could help them out with the information of like, um, it's possible that no one would ever know or what have you, that your cousin is like visiting X number of days or what have you. But also just be aware that it says here in your lease that if your landlord sees that you could be fined X amount of money for having someone that's not on the lease or what have you. So I guess that would be my thought, is that you're like best way to help is just provide this information so that they can make the decision themselves. I don't know.
And they will not receive a financial fine. They will receive a lease violation. And depending
Okay.
on what's in that lease, you can get so many lease violations and then they can start eviction.
Okay. Yeah, no, so that's good information to know. Let's see, and I believe that that is all the questions that we have for today. Thank you again to Lynette, and thank you to everyone out there for attending today's Lunch and Learn. We'd like to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn and hear your suggestions for future topics. We ask that you take a moment right now to complete a survey. You can use your phone to follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link in the chat. Either way, we look forward to hearing from you. Today, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.